Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 43, and we're going to talk about being anti-farming, but not anti-war. The problem of focusing on issues versus keeping consistent with a principle. So what inspired this episode was a story I saw that in Ireland, they're planning to kill 200,000 cows to meet the EU's, the European Union's climate change goals. All right, well, over 3 years, they have to kill 200,000 cows. Forget that this means, don't think about the fact that it means food prices are going to go higher. A lot of farmers are going to be out of work. Unemployment will be a problem. And all of the related industries that support the maintenance of 200,000 cows, yeah, they're going to be destroyed as well. But that's not important. What's important is climate change goals, right? I haven't really talked about climate change in a previous episode. I may eventually, but it's all subjective, right? So whether it's really important or not, it's extremely subjective, especially if you live long enough, you realize that every few years you have doomsayers saying that the world is going to come to an end in 5 years or 10 years. When I was a kid, they said 20 years. We had 20 years left. That was 40 years ago. So, they're always saying that, and it's to create panic. It's to push legislation through, but it has very little to do with uh, climate change. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the conclusion. So the EU passed a bill to reduce agricultural emissions and promote biodiversity and sustainable land and soil use. It sounds kind of good, but then they said that they have to take more decisive action because some countries in the EU are not making progress in stopping the extinction of certain species of animals. And so therefore they have to take more drastic action in getting rid of some farmland. And this has caused a lot of upset farmers to protest against their government. And I heard about the Danish farmers. I think it was in the middle of the lockdowns. It was around the time of the Canadian trucker convoys where they were protesting the government. And I thought, wow, okay, there's no fear about the cervasis over there. But what the government was saying was that the farmland has to be replaced with peat land. And peatland apparently is like marshy, full of decaying plants kind of areas, which absorbs a lot of CO2. So peatlands cover only 3% of the Earth's surface, but absorbs twice as much CO2 as all of the forests and the trees in the entire world combined, which I find a little bit difficult to believe. But nevertheless, that's what environmentalists would say, because apparently a scientist said it once, and so it must be true. So more than half of the EU's peatlands are gone. This is very bad. I mean, CO2 just being unprocessed all over the place. And 7% of EU's CO2 output is from this repurposed peatlands. And so they want to return it or get rid of the farms and make them peatlands again. This is sort of another example of the EU's stop oil kind of, environmentalist fanaticism. So not only are people throwing cans of tomato juice or tomato soup on oil paintings and gluing themselves onto runways, but they also block traffic, right, by walking or sitting in the middle of the road. So forget about all the CO2 that is caused by just idling cars, So, okay, whatever. But what I find kind of inconsistent and what makes it kind of ridiculous to me is that none of those people walking slowly in the streets are protesting the war. which creates far more CO2 than a car, a jet plane flying across the sky. That certainly creates far more CO2 than probably I will in my entire lifetime. So, but they're not protesting the war. The war is apparently okay. And this, which is why people like me, anyway, can't help but think that it's just a lot of virtue signaling. That, yeah, maybe CO2 is a problem. Maybe I haven't seen or heard anything that would make me think that it was, but yeah, it just seems like a lot of virtue signaling. Plus, a lot of these people who are doing these protests, they seem to be very comfortable in their lives, not only wearing and using products that are made possible because of petroleum, but also their lifestyles seem to indicate that they can afford to spend the day walking in traffic, not working. And so I can't help but think, and I might be wrong, and it's probably not all of them, but a good number of them, I would even wager some of their leaders, are just bored rich people unaffected by rising commodity prices. I remember reading that two girls that had thrown tomato soup or something on a painting, went back to their mansion, owned by their parents, and plotting their next attack. So basically bored rich people who can't see beyond their own narrow subjectivity. So I mentioned that they're not protesting war because what about war? Well, you can Google this and pretty much you will find all kinds of news outlets and information sites that will tell you that the US military emits more carbon than entire countries. And it's not just the burning down of buildings and factories and infrastructure that creates the CO2, but it's also all of the vehicles, planes, helicopters, transporting troops and tanks and equipment all over the world. It burns a lot of fuel, very expensive. And so it creates a lot of CO2. In addition to that, there are a lot of other military practices which are extremely toxic and they pollute the environment. So not only the dumping of jet fuel if a plane takes off from an aircraft carrier and there's a problem, so they have to land back onto the aircraft carrier, they have to dump all their fuel first before they land, and that just goes right into the ocean, but no one really cares about that. Also, we talked about cluster bombs. Cluster bombs, in a way, is a kind of pollution, right? They're basically dropping mines, explosives everywhere. Vietnam had a problem with cluster bombs, unexploded cluster bomblets all over their country for years. And now Ukraine, I heard, is the most mined country in the world. So not only unexploded cluster bomb munitions, but mines that were put and buried in fields everywhere to kill the enemy. Well, they're not digging them up, which means that they're going to sit around there until someone else decides they're going to go back to farming and they trigger a mine. But no one really seems to care about that, right? Because the Russians are really evil, which maybe they are, but uh, I have a hard time justifying and supporting the war, whether it's Zelensky or Putin, doesn't matter to me. So what is interesting is that war in general, not just the US military, and a lot of this climate fanaticism, they both have the goal of reducing the human population, right? So war just straight up kills people. And if you reduce farm production, you reduce the availability of food, well, yeah, a lot of people are going to die. And this seems to be, a deliberate policy, not so much the war stuff, but the farming, the reduction of agricultural emissions definitely seems to be. But both of these scenarios is a part of government problems, right? Scientific American had an article about palm oil or biofuel. And they said, oh, we would, but we don't have to use fossil fuel. We can use biofuel like palm oil. But the problem with palm oil is you have to grow the palms first in order to get the oil. Now, I don't know the details on how you get the palm oil, but nevertheless, you got to grow the palm trees first. You're not going to be able to do it in New York, America. So you got to ask other countries to do it. And so Indonesia said that they would supply the biofuel mandated by the US government about 10 years ago. But in order to grow the palms, they had to burn down their rainforest, and burn down the rainforest they did. And the CO2 output from those burning rainforests, you would need 20 years of biofuel use to offset all that CO2 production. It doesn't seem like it's a good idea. The Maryland Clean Energy legislation, we'll call it the Clean Energy Jobs Act of 2019. It basically counts burning trash as renewable energy, right? So there it is, a reclassification, fiddling with the definition so that the trash lobby, right, all of the people who are involved in trash collecting and disposal, they're not upset. So you keep their votes, but you also trick everyone into thinking you're doing something for the environment. So there's that. So that's a government phenomena. So it's interesting to me to hear all these people saying, oh, we just got to legislate this and all our problems are solved, as if corrupt politicians are actually going to do what they say they're going to do. It's kind of absurd. So politicians posture that they really care about the environment, but really all they're doing is catering to corporate interests. And so really, whether it's war or climate change fanaticism, it doesn't matter. You just have to follow the money. Where's the money flowing? Where does it flow from? Where is it going? And that would probably do more to explain what's going on in the world than any kind of political speech. Now, why do we have these kinds of absurdities, these contradictions, these examples of hypocrisy? And it's because most people today, at least in the United States, are educated to think in terms of issues, right? So, oh, gender equality, that's the issue, what's the solution? And so most people who go to school today will hear about a problem, and then their teachers, being the all-knowing, wise adult in the room, will tell them, this is what we got to do. This is the solution to this problem. And what do students know? Not a whole lot. All they care about is passing the next test. And then some people who love to do the virtue signaling, right? They're like, I'm doing the right thing. That makes me a good person. They believe it, that that's the only possible solution for this constructed, subjectively constructed problem. Right. And so this is an issue focused mentality. So even when people go to vote, they say, well, what does that politician believe about this issue? So even one of my respected, one of the few that I have left, colleagues who I actually respect, he confessed to me that he is a one issue voter, right? And so is a politician pro or against war? And that's what the criteria he uses to vote for a politician. The problem is, though, that clearly it sets up manipulation, right? So a politician knows that there are certain people who are anti-war. If they're in the majority, then that's what he's going to say. He says, I'm opposed to war. And if people are pro-abortion, then you're going to say, oh, I support abortion. You're just going to say the things where you believe you're going to get the most number of votes. However, over time, you will see that it is inconsistent. I just saw a story, this was in Latvia, a Latvian woman, she was like in a wheelchair, and very old. She was being deported from Latvia because she failed a language test. I guess they're doing, citizenship tests over there. And if you can't speak the language fluently, then you're not allowed to live there, which is probably designed and targeting certain unwanted, undesirable immigrants. But what happens is other people get caught up in that legislation, people who you didn't really want to target, but who now fall victim to that legislation. That would be the unintended consequences of virtue signaling based legislation, right? So anyway, people focus only on what they know inside the box, right? So they can't imagine how other people might work out a better solution, right? Because they learn this is the problem, this is the solution. Anyone else who disagrees, well, you're just a fascist or a Nazi or something like that. So people only think inside the box, and they feel good because they think they know what the proper solution is. But this is actually arrogance. The arrogance of thinking that you know you have the solution, that you know everything that there is to be known. And so you have the end-all, be-all solution to this problem. And so then everyone else who disagrees with you is because they're ignorant. And so you have to force them to do it your way. And this is what leads to contradictions, hypocrisy, injustice, favoritism, corruption, and the unintended consequences, right? And this is where you get people who are pro-war, but also, anti-farming, right? Right. Without realizing that war creates more pollution than farming, imagine that. And so focusing on the issues allows you to miss all of these contradictions. It allows you to overlook hypocrisy, right? But how can you be a hypocrite? You have the correct position on all of the important issues. Forget the fact that they are all contradictions and they all will lead to injustice. No one really cares about that. And that's how a lot of people get tripped up, like an intelligent interviewer, maybe like Tucker Carlson or someone like that, who will actually ask good follow-up questions. Most politicians get tripped up, right? Because they're only practicing, the the script, what they're supposed to say, what their staff prepared for them to say. Either they're reading from note cards or this is what I'm supposed to say. And so none of it makes sense. And so when you try to bring them all together, it leads to contradictions. It trips up a lot of politicians. A lot of them just simply get angry or they have nothing to say. So learning what the problems are and then learning what other people say the solutions are is learning how to live in a box, right? It's a simple way to live for the simple-minded people and those people who lack imagination, but also awesome for authoritarians who want to control those simple-minded, unimaginative people. In contrast to that, if you live according to principles, you can be consistent in life. You don't need cue cards. You don't need crib sheets to try to remember what you're supposed to say, what the right position is. You just work out, well, what falls in line with the principle that I've decided to use. And because it's a personal thing, you can't legislate it, right? Everyone is going to have their own principles, which decides their own personal priorities and choices and decisions. Each individual gets to decide how consistent and faithful they are to those principles or not, but it's personal. So then no one really cares so much about your hypocrisy or contradiction because you're not forcing anyone else to abide by those principles. As long as you have them and you're allowed to pursue them, why should you care about other people? In class every semester, I assign a paper where I ask, some of my classes where I ask them to try to come up with a life principle, a principle to live by, to help evaluate all situations and then come to a decision, right? To decide what choice you're going to make. And you can have a bad principle. I had several students who said, I'm going to live a self-centered life. And I said, what does that mean? It's like, well, if I make a promise, I'll break the promise if it doesn't benefit me. And I said, well, you got to consider that there are consequences to making lots of promises and then breaking those promises, right? there are consequences. And so he thought about that and he was like, oh, I'll have to get back to you on that. Then I forget what he ultimately wrote, but now think of something, a positive principle, right, which does take in consideration lots of consequences, would be principles like this podcast. No hypocrisy, no coercion. So any idea that you hear, if it's not hypocritical and it's not coercive, oh, then it's possible that it's a good idea. So rather than, so if you hear an idea like say, oh, we got to reduce, carbon emissions, we got to stop farming, people have to stop farming, forget about the private jet I just flew in to tell you that you got to stop farming. You just got to stop farming, right? So rather than using coercion and massive amounts of hypocrisy, what you do is you inspire or you motivate people to be creative, to try to think of creative solutions to existing problems. Even the agricultural problem, if you think about it, by making farming more efficient, having the grains have more yield, right? Some people might call this manipulation of the crops or anything. But hey, less land to produce more food for more people. Hey, let's do that, right? It's not coercive, it's not hypocritical, and so it could be a possible solution. So when you think in terms of principles, because you want to maintain and be consistent to your life principle, your values, the things that you consider important, it inspires you to come up with creative solutions so that you can keep your principle. This also has the benefit of avoiding contradiction and hypocrisy, and thus injustice as well, right? Because people are focused on issues, we have injustice everywhere. And as I said before, innovation is the way out of the box. Innovation is the way to keep society moving forward, not coercion. Innovation also leads to greater efficiency with less waste, with lower costs. And this also means no need for war. And so in a fell swoop, we resolved both of those issues that I started the podcast with: war and anti-farming mentality. I will talk to you in the next episode. Oh, by the way, I am also on Instagram, Subjective Professor. Yeah, so I'll talk to you next time.